And the conflict in Ukraine is going exceptionally badly for Ukraine. Sadly, huge amounts of people are dying in the conflict. The Ukrainian military has suffered a terribly significant strategic defeat in Avdiivka, a fortress city that has been fortified by the Ukrainian army with NATO assistance since 2014, basically. A big regional fortress which is very close to Donetsk, the main city that dissented from the post-Maidan government after the coup in 2014. Now, with the fall of Avdiivka and numerous other small settlements in the last number of days, we're starting to see a panic almost in the West at the realization of several things. Firstly, and most importantly, is the reality that the Ukrainian military cannot defeat the Russian army. Most independent, objective analysts with any kind of education in warfare studies knew this, other than those on the payrolls of the think tanks in the West. The BBC, Sky News, ITN, all these ex-British officers who never fought anybody other than a couple of farmers in Afghanistan who beat them in the end, believed that Ukraine could actually win this war, whatever winning this war means, in the context of what's actually happening there. But now it's patently obvious, it's indefensible. They can't even defend their own propaganda. First Abrams tanks burning yesterday, close to Avdiivka as well. So as this happens, countries like Germany, France, I think Italy, the UK signing these independent defense pact agreements with Ukraine, with Zelensky. But what do they mean? Well, potentially they mean that German, French, British troops could go into Ukraine when the Ukrainian parliament asked them to intervene. It wouldn't be a NATO intervention, but it would mean potentially NATO troops, not under a NATO mandate, entering Ukraine. And today, yesterday, Dmitry Peskov, who is Vladimir Putin's spokesman at the Kremlin, made it very clear, and this is exceptionally important that people back home understand the gravity of this move by the West, who, according to Robert Fico, the Slovakian Prime Minister, were discussing actively the potential of sending in troops into Ukraine, if we're to believe this rumor. And Dmitry Peskov has said, and in absolute clarity, he has said, that if British, French, Italian, German troops entered Ukraine, this would be a basic declaration of war on Russia. And Russia would strike those troops. I paraphrase him now, but Russia would act to strike them as soon as they came over the border. Now, how close are they to the border now? Well, it just so happens that NATO is conducting a huge land-based exercise close to Ukraine, close to the border with Ukraine, in Romania. 20,000 NATO troops, a lot of material and men. Not enough to make a huge impact in Ukraine, but an impact nonetheless. They just so happen to be currently engaged in this huge exercise. Now, all of these things aligning with the signing of these defense pacts, what does it mean for ordinary European citizens? Well, it means several things. Firstly, it means that your sons, daughters, husbands, fathers will die in Ukraine. They will be sent to Ukraine. The diminished militaries of NATO, with their lack of equipment, shells, machinery, which the Russians have shown can burn like anything else. Sadly, many have died demonstrating this weapons sales strategy by the Americans and British predominantly in Ukraine. But it means they will die. They will die. This means war. It means a war on a scale which would make the Ukrainian conflict look like a picnic. And it is no picnic, believe me. Over 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died, despite the lies that Volodymyr Zelensky is telling you. Over 400,000 Ukrainians have died. Ukrainians know that. British and American analysts know this. And they are facilitating this lie because there is a political rationale for these lies. But it means your people, our people, British people, Irish people in those forces, French, Germans will die in their tens of thousands in Ukraine. Because as soon as they cross the border on this deployment, I believe, and sadly, many analysts believe that they would be struck by Russia's long-range capabilities, which they have demonstrated on the borders of Poland, on the borders of Romania. And they have said this, they have said, we will consider this a declaration of war. We will strike these forces if they cross into Ukraine. Just like they said, if you continue to expand NATO, we will consider it an existential threat to Russia. Now, you don't have to agree with Vladimir Putin. You don't have to agree with Russia's position. You can ignore all of the fact-based reality around Russia's position regarding being declined closer association with NATO, regarding its hand being slapped away when it reached out to the West over decades post the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can deny the reality that NATO, established to counter the Soviet threat, the communist threat in Europe, in the North Atlantic region, that was established for that. You can deny the fact that it should have disappeared in 1991 when the Warsaw Pact disappeared, when the Soviet Union disappeared, when the threat that gave it a rationale for existence, if one existed, disappeared. Yet NATO grew, it expanded, it moved eastwards. It moved eastwards aggressively in an attempt to do what exactly? My view is it was an attempt to realize its rationale for existence, which was a conflict with Russia, to also become and realize its potential as a huge weapon sales program, which it is, and which we know now because we've got people like Antony Blinken, Jens Stoltenberg, and various other neoconservative hawks, pro-war people in the West, telling us that war is good for the American economy. That's what it's come to. Hundreds of thousands of dead Slavic people here in Europe, and war is good for the American economy. And now they want more money. And now they're holding a huge exercise on the borders of Ukraine. And now they're talking about sending troops into Ukraine. Your husbands, your sons, paid with your money, who will die in Ukraine. They'll die there. As many Russians are dying, as many Ukrainians are dying, they will then die. And this, in my view, is probably the most dangerous moment on the continent, the European continent, since 1939 probably. And it's not because the people of Europe, like you, in the US, in Germany, in France, in Italy, all the intelligent, peace-loving people who want an end to this war, just like many in Ukraine, many in Russia, of course, who never wanted the war in the first place, despite the deluded, schizophrenic propaganda of the client media in the West. It is you that will pay. Us, our families. We have this potential as human beings to think we live at the end of history. We're always looking back. We're always looking back at events that happened before, that they'll never happen again. People thought that prior to the outbreak of the First War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Great Prussian Wars, the vast wars that swept across Europe over centuries, killing millions of Europeans. We think that we're at the end of events. We're at the end of history. We're not at the end of history. We are a part of history, and it's a moving train, and we're just in a carriage of it. And the people driving the train right now, Justin Trudeau, Ursula von der Leyen, Rishi Sunak, and Olaf Scholz, these are the statespeople who are in charge of our destiny and the destiny of our families, our children's, and our futures. And while they pontificate about the environment and the woke agenda that a man can become a woman and vice versa, that is the obsession of the liberal West now, it seems. While they do that, they allow this train to roll inexorably towards conflict, a vast conflict, which could potentially draw in China as Russia's ally. People need to think about what these half-wits in charge of the governments of Europe are driving us towards. You don't have to agree with Russia, but you must listen to what Russia says. And Russia is saying, believe me, this is what they're saying. Let me translate. They're saying, no further, come no further. If members of NATO countries dispatch troops into Ukraine, this could potentially spark a huge continental conflict. People need to wake up and understand what this would mean for them. Then it won't be merely a problem of Ukrainians coming to occupy all the hotels in your country, or people complaining about them getting free this and free that. This will be your kids, your family, your father, your son,